The cold stone floors of Canterbury Cathedral echoed with the clash of steel and the shouts of armed men. It was December 29, 1170, and Archbishop Thomas Becket stood defiant before 4 knights sent by King Henry II. As the first blade struck, splitting his skull, the most shocking murder of the medieval age unfolded. But was this a crime of passion or a royal assassination? Behind the bloodshed lay a power struggle that shook England to its core. A king's fury, a church's defiance, and 4 swordsmen caught between them. What really happened that night? Was Becket's death a tragic accident or a carefully planned elimination? To understand the truth, we must step into the shadows of 12th century politics, where faith and power collided with brutal consequences. This is not just a story of martyrdom, it's a medieval murder mystery with kings, knights, and a conspiracy that echoes through history. Stay with us as we unravel the evidence, expose the hidden motives, and answer the question that has haunted historians for centuries: who really ordered the killing of Thomas Becket? To uncover the roots of this deadly feud, we must rewind to the beginning when Thomas Becket and Henry II were not enemies but allies. Becket started as Henry's trusted chancellor, a worldly and ambitious man who shared the king's vision of strengthening royal authority. But everything changed when Henry appointed Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1161. The king expected his loyal friend to side with the crown in its growing clashes with the church. Instead, Becket underwent a dramatic transformation. He embraced his new role with fierce devotion, defending the church's independence at every turn. The breaking point came with the Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, a set of laws Henry imposed to curb the church's power. Becket initially wavered, then openly defied them, igniting a bitter struggle. Henry saw this as betrayal. Becket saw it as duty. Their friendship shattered, and Henry's wrath grew, exiling Becket for 6 long years. But exile couldn't silence the archbishop. From abroad, he continued to challenge Henry, excommunicating the king's allies and deepening the rift. This wasn't just a personal feud, it was a battle for the soul of medieval England, where the lines between king and clergy, loyalty and faith, blurred into violence. And as we'll see next, Becket's eventual return would turn this simmering conflict into a fatal confrontation. Now, as the winds of change began to blow, Becket stepped back onto English soil in the year 1170, a moment charged with tension and unspoken threats. His return from exile wasn't just a homecoming, it was a direct challenge to Henry II's authority. The unresolved disputes between them still simmered, and Becket made no effort to soften his stance. If anything, his years abroad had hardened his resolve. He landed in Kent to a mix of cheers from supporters and wary silence from those loyal to the king, the air thick with the unasked question: what would happen next? Becket's arrival was loaded with symbolism. By returning unarmed but unyielding, he sent a clear message: he wouldn't back down, even if it cost him everything. His first act, lifting the excommunications Henry had forced him to impose while abroad, a move that struck right at the king's allies. This wasn't reconciliation, it was escalation. And how did Henry react? Reports suggest fury, but also calculation. The king, away in Normandy, didn't rush to confront Becket directly. Instead, he let the tension build, perhaps hoping the archbishop's boldness would alienate even his own supporters. But Becket wasn't just fighting for himself, he'd become a symbol of resistance, a living reminder that the church wouldn't bow to royal will. Every sermon he preached, every decree he issued, was a spark in the tinderbox of their feud. The stage was set. With Becket back in Canterbury, the conflict wasn't just reignited, it was hurtling toward a point of no return. And as we'll soon see, the king's next words would turn that smoldering tension into a flame that consumed them both. But then came the moment that would echo through history, the words that may have sealed Becket's fate. Frustrated, isolated, and simmering with rage, Henry II is said to have roared to his court, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" A single sentence, but one that crackled with dangerous ambiguity. Was it a king's desperate cry, a veiled command, or something even more calculated? Contemporary accounts disagree. Some, like the chronicler Edward Grimm, paint it as a spontaneous outburst, a man pushed to his limits, venting his fury. Others suggest it was deliberate, a carefully chosen provocation meant to stir his knights without leaving a paper trail. And then there's the chilling possibility that Henry knew exactly what his words would unleash. The knights who heard it certainly took it as a call to action, but here's the twist: Henry never named Becket directly. He called him a turbulent priest, a phrase vague enough to deny later. Was that strategic, a way to distance himself if things went too far? Or was it simply the heat of the moment, a king's frustration boiling over? What we do know is this: those words became a spark in dry tinder. Whether Henry intended it or not, they set 4 knights on a path to Canterbury, and Becket on a collision course with martyrdom. But to understand why they acted, we need to look closer at the men who answered Henry's cry. Who were they, and what drove them to cross that fatal line? That's where the story takes its darkest turn. Now, let's turn our attention to the 4 men who stepped out of the shadows of history to commit one of its most infamous crimes. Reginald Fitz-Urse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton were not faceless assassins. They were knights of standing, bound by oaths and ambition. But what drove them to raise their swords against an archbishop? Reginald Fitz-Urse was the most prominent of the 4, a man with deep ties to Henry's court. His name even hinted at his nature, Fitz-Urse meaning son of the bear, a fitting symbol for a man known for his ferocity. Hugh de Morville, on the other hand, was a seasoned administrator, a man who understood power and how to wield it. Then there was William de Tracy, whose family had long served the crown, and Richard le Breton, a knight with a reputation for unwavering loyalty. These were not reckless mercenaries. They were men of rank, accustomed to the complexities of royal service. So why did they act? Some historians argue it was pure devotion to Henry, a twisted interpretation of their duty to rid the king of a perceived threat. Others suggest more personal motives, land, favor, or even grudges buried in the tangled politics of the time. One chilling detail stands out. After the murder, the knights fled to Knaresborough Castle, owned by Morville. There, they reportedly dined together, as if celebrating their deed. Was this the behavior of men who believed they'd carried out their king's will, or something darker, a calculated act by those who saw opportunity in Henry's rage? The truth may lie in their backgrounds. Fitz-Urse and de Tracy had clashed with Becket before, their families entangled in disputes with the church. Morville and le Breton, meanwhile, were enforcers, men used to solving problems with steel. Together, they formed a lethal combination: loyalty, ambition, and a willingness to cross a line that others wouldn't. But here's the unsettling question: did they act alone, or were they part of a broader web with strings pulled by figures even higher in Henry's court? To unravel that, we must follow their path to Canterbury, a journey that would end in bloodshed under the cathedral's vaulted arches. Now, let's follow the footsteps of these 4 knights as they made their way to Canterbury. Their journey wasn't a frantic rush, it was a deliberate march, one that raises questions about whether this was a crime of passion or something far more calculated. The knights left Henry's court in Normandy and crossed the English Channel, arriving in Kent with a singular purpose. Along the way, they stopped at Saltwood Castle, a stronghold held by one of Becket's fiercest opponents, Ranulph de Broc. Here, they gathered reinforcements, arming themselves not just with weapons but with resolve. This wasn't the behavior of men acting on a sudden impulse. It was the methodical preparation of those who knew exactly what they intended to do. When they reached Canterbury on December 29th, they didn't storm the cathedral in a blind rage. First, they confronted Becket in his chambers, demanding he absolve the bishops who had sided with Henry. Becket refused, his defiance unwavering even as the knights' threats grew darker. Witnesses later recalled how the archbishop seemed almost resigned, as if he sensed what was coming. Some even claimed he had been warned. Rumors swirled that friends had urged him to flee or bar the cathedral doors. But Becket stood his ground, a decision that would seal his fate. The knights withdrew briefly, only to return with their weapons. What happened next wasn't a chaotic brawl, but a chillingly precise attack. They cornered Becket near the altar, and when he still refused to yield, their swords found their mark. The brutality of the act, combined with the cold efficiency of their movements, suggests this was no spontaneous outburst. Every step, from their journey to their final confrontation, hints at a plan long in the making. But here's what lingers in the shadows of this story. If this was truly premeditated, who else might have known? The knights didn't operate in a vacuum. Their path to Canterbury was lined with allies, men who shared their grievances or stood to gain from Becket's fall. As we peel back the layers of this tragedy, the question isn't just how they killed him, but how many hands were really on the hilt of that sword. Next, we step into the cathedral itself, where the echoes of that fateful day still whisper from the stones. What unfolded in those final moments would shake England to its core. Now, let's step inside Canterbury Cathedral on that fateful December evening, where the final act of this tragedy unfolded with terrifying precision. The air was thick with tension as the four knights returned, their swords drawn, their faces set with grim determination. Becket had retreated to the cathedral, perhaps seeking sanctuary, but there would be no refuge. Witnesses later described how the knights burst into the dimly lit church, their voices echoing off the stone walls as they demanded Becket submit to the king's will one last time. The archbishop stood near the altar, clad in his robes, his expression calm but unyielding. "I am ready to die," he reportedly said, "but you will not touch my men." His defiance only fueled their rage. Then came the first blow. One of the knights swung his sword, striking Becket's head with enough force to knock him to his knees. But it wasn't enough to silence him. Even as blood streamed down his face, Becket prayed aloud, his words a mix of defiance and devotion. The second strike landed with brutal efficiency, splitting his skull and sending fragments of bone scattering across the floor. Still, the knights weren't done. A third slash nearly severed his hand, as if to punish him for the blessings he'd given. By the fourth blow, Becket lay motionless, his life bleeding out onto the sacred stones. The chaos that followed was as shocking as the murder itself. Monks and clergy who had hidden in fear now rushed forward, some wailing, others frozen in horror. The knights, their task complete, fled into the night, leaving behind a scene so gruesome that even hardened witnesses struggled to describe it. Becket's blood pooled around his body, his robes torn, his face barely recognizable. Yet in that moment, something else became clear. This wasn't just a killing. It was a spectacle, a message carved in steel and delivered with chilling intent. But the story doesn't end here. In the wake of such violence, whispers began to spread. Some claimed they'd seen a strange light fill the cathedral as Becket died, or heard voices chanting in the shadows. Whether divine intervention or the fevered imaginings of traumatized onlookers, one thing was certain: the murder of Thomas Becket would echo far beyond those blood-stained walls. Next, we'll unravel the immediate aftermath, the shockwaves that rippled across England, and the swift, unexpected reactions that followed. Because in the end, a death this public could never be buried quietly. The moment news of Becket's murder broke, England erupted in disbelief. Shock rippled through every corner of the kingdom, from the bustling streets of London to the quiet villages of the countryside. Ordinary people, nobles and clergy alike, were stunned. How could such a brutal act happen in a holy place? The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds gathered outside cathedrals, their voices rising in anger and grief, while whispers of rebellion hummed in the air. The Church, already a powerful force, seized on the public's fury, framing Becket's death as a martyrdom that demanded justice. Meanwhile, the 4 knights who had carried out the killing vanished into the night. They knew their lives were forfeit if they stayed. Fleeing across the Channel, they sought refuge in distant castles, but even there they couldn't escape the growing storm. Excommunicated by the Pope and hunted by public scorn, their names became synonymous with treachery. Yet curiously, no one moved to arrest them, at least not yet. Was it fear, political maneuvering, or something darker that kept them from facing swift punishment? Then there was Henry II. When word reached him of what had happened, the king's reaction was dramatic. Some accounts claim he collapsed in grief, tearing his clothes and fasting for days. Others say he retreated into seclusion, stricken with guilt. Whether his remorse was genuine or a calculated act, Henry knew he had to act fast. Within weeks, he performed a public penance so striking it would be remembered for centuries. Barefoot and dressed in sackcloth, he walked through the streets of Canterbury, allowing monks to whip him as he wept at Becket's tomb. It was a spectacle designed to quell the uprising brewing against him. But did it really absolve him of blame? And then came the miracles. Almost overnight, stories began circulating of healings and visions near Becket's grave. A blind woman regained her sight. A dying child awoke, fever gone. Whether divine intervention or the power of belief, these tales spread like wildfire, turning Becket into a saint in the eyes of the people long before the Pope made it official. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury, their footsteps wearing paths into the earth, their offerings transforming the cathedral into one of the richest shrines in Europe. The Church, quick to capitalize, declared Becket a martyr, his blood a relic, his death a testament to faith over tyranny. But beneath the surface, questions lingered. Had Henry's penance been enough? Why were the knights still free? And most haunting of all, had Becket's murder been a tragic mistake, or exactly what someone wanted? The answers would shape not just England's future, but the balance of power between kings and popes for centuries to come. Next, we'll dig deeper into Henry's role. Was he a king cornered by his own words, or a mastermind who knew exactly what he was unleashing? Because when power and vengeance collide, the truth is rarely simple. Now let's turn our attention to Henry II himself, the king at the center of this storm. The burning question isn't just whether he played a role in Becket's death, but how deep that role went. Did his infamous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" cross the line from frustration into a direct order? Or was it merely a reckless remark seized upon by overzealous knights? The truth may lie in Henry's own actions after the murder. His dramatic public penance at Becket's tomb, where he endured humiliation and physical punishment, could be read 2 ways. On one hand, it might suggest genuine remorse, a king shattered by the consequences of his words. Medieval rulers rarely subjected themselves to such displays unless deeply affected. Yet, on the other hand, it was also a masterstroke of political theater. By performing penance, Henry diffused the explosive anger threatening his reign. The Church, eager to avoid open war with the crown, accepted his act of contrition, and the public's fury began to cool. A convenient coincidence, perhaps. Then there's the matter of the knights themselves. If Henry had truly wanted them punished, it would have happened swiftly. Instead, they remained free for years, their excommunication lifted only after quiet negotiations. Some historians argue this delay hints at protection from above, that Henry, while publicly condemning their actions, privately ensured they faced no real consequences. Others point to the tangled web of medieval justice, where even kings couldn't always control outcomes, but the most damning evidence might be what Henry didn't do. He never publicly denied ordering Becket's death. He never punished those who carried it out, and within years of the murder, he quietly rolled back many of the church reforms Becket had died defending. If this was all just a tragic misunderstanding, why did Henry benefit so directly? The final piece of the puzzle is time. Henry ruled for over 2 decades after Becket's death, and in those years he never faced serious rebellion over the murder. The church, now wielding Becket's sainthood as a weapon, grew stronger, but so did Henry's grip on power. A king who truly lost control wouldn't have kept his throne so long. So where does that leave us? Henry may not have planned the murder, but his words lit the fuse, and when the smoke cleared, he was the one who walked away with everything he'd wanted. That's not an accident, it's the mark of a ruler who understood the weight of his influence, even if he claimed otherwise. Next, we'll see how the church turned tragedy into triumph, as Becket's canonization reshaped the balance of power in medieval Europe. Because when a martyr rises, someone always stands to gain. Now let's shift our focus to the aftermath, where the church seized this moment to transform tragedy into triumph. Within just 3 years of Becket's murder, Pope Alexander III declared him a saint, an astonishingly fast canonization for the medieval era. This wasn't just about honoring a martyr, it was a strategic masterstroke. The speed of Becket's sainthood sent a clear message. By elevating him so quickly, the church underscored the gravity of Henry's transgression, framing the murder as an attack on divine authority itself. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury, miracles were attributed to Becket's intercession, and his shrine became one of Europe's most revered sites. Overnight, the archbishop's defiance against royal interference became a rallying cry for the church's independence. But the real power lay in the symbolism. Becket's canonization wasn't merely spiritual, it was political. Every prayer offered at his tomb reinforced the idea that the church, not kings, held ultimate moral authority. Henry's penance had been a temporary fix, but Becket's sainthood was a permanent weapon. The Pope knew this. By making Becket a saint, he turned the archbishop's death into an unanswerable argument against royal overreach. And the impact was immediate. Clergy across Europe pointed to Becket's fate as proof that resisting secular power was holy work. Kings hesitated before challenging church privileges, fearing they might create another martyr and another backlash. The balance of power had shifted, not through armies or treaties, but through the story of one man's bloody end. Yet there's a twist. Some historians argue the Pope's swift action wasn't just about principle, it was also about pragmatism. With Becket gone, the church could claim victory without further confrontation. Henry, chastened by the scandal, became more cautious in his dealings with Rome. In canonizing Becket, the Pope didn't just honor a martyr, he secured a truce. So what did this mean for the future? Becket's sainthood set a precedent. It showed that the church could turn even defeat into long-term leverage, using martyrdom to outmaneuver monarchs. And as we'll see next, the knights who thought they'd silenced a troublemaker instead made him immortal, a lesson in how violence can backfire spectacularly. But what about the 4 knights who carried out the murder? Their story takes a darker turn. After fleeing Canterbury, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton found themselves outcast. The Pope swiftly excommunicated them, cutting them off from the church and society. Stripped of their spiritual comforts and branded as murderers, they became pariahs in a world where divine favor meant everything. Yet their punishment didn't end there. Legends claim the knights embarked on desperate pilgrimages to atone for their crime. Some accounts say they traveled to Rome barefoot and in rags, begging for absolution. Pope Alexander III allegedly ordered them to serve as knights in the Holy Land for 14 years, a harsh penance that hinted at the church's lingering fury. But the most chilling tales involved their deaths. Rumors spread that divine justice pursued them. Fitzurse supposedly died screaming in agony, his body rotting before his final breath. De Tracy was said to have been consumed by worms, while Le Breton met his end in a freak storm. Whether these stories were true or just moral fables, they served a purpose: to warn others that killing a man of God carried consequences beyond the grave. Ironically, Henry II never punished them directly. Some historians argue he quietly protected them, fearing their testimony might implicate him further. Others suggest their exile was punishment enough, living as cursed men haunted by their deed. Either way, their fates became a cautionary tale, reinforcing the idea that Becket's martyrdom had unleashed forces even a king couldn't control. And so the knights vanished into history, their names synonymous with treachery. But their legacy lingers, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, violence against the church didn't just risk earthly justice. It risked something far worse, the wrath of heaven itself. Now, let's turn to the aftermath of Becket's death, not just the political fallout, but the spiritual phenomenon that followed. Almost overnight, Canterbury Cathedral became the epicenter of a religious revolution. Pilgrims from every corner of Europe began flocking to Becket's tomb, convinced that the martyred archbishop held divine power. The stories of miracles started almost immediately. Blind men claimed to regain their sight after touching the tomb. The sick swore they were healed by praying near his relics. Even the skeptical couldn't ignore the sheer volume of testimonies, so many that the church officially recorded hundreds of miracles within just a few years. These weren't just tales, they were fuel for a growing cult of devotion, turning Becket into one of medieval Europe's most revered saints. But this wasn't just about faith, it was about money and influence too. Canterbury's economy boomed as pilgrims poured in, spending on food, lodging, and souvenirs. The cathedral itself grew richer, with donations funding grand expansions and lavish decorations. Becket's shrine became a must-see destination, a spiritual powerhouse that rivaled even Rome in its pull, and the impact went deeper. Becket's martyrdom gave the church a powerful symbol in its struggle against royal authority. Every pilgrim who knelt at his tomb was a silent protest against kings who dared challenge the clergy. The message was clear: defy the church, and you risked not just earthly rebellion but divine retribution. By the time Henry II himself performed public penance at the tomb, barefoot and weeping, the cult of St. Thomas was unstoppable. For centuries, his shrine drew the faithful, the desperate, and the curious, proof that in death, Becket had achieved what he never could in life: undeniable, unshakable power. Now, let's peel back the layers of how the church crafted the story of Becket's death to serve its own ends. This wasn't just about honoring a fallen archbishop, it was a masterclass in medieval propaganda. The church needed a martyr, and Becket's brutal murder provided the perfect raw material. Take the writings of Edward Grimm, a monk who witnessed the assassination firsthand. His account didn't just describe the event, it dramatized it, painting Becket as a serene, almost Christ-like figure who embraced his fate with divine calm. Grimm's version showed Becket kneeling in prayer as the night struck, his last words a blessing for his killers. But how much of this was fact and how much was carefully crafted myth? Other hagiographies, those saintly biographies, took the legend even further. They emphasized Becket's defiance, his refusal to compromise with Henry, and his willingness to die for the church's independence. These stories weren't neutral records, they were tools designed to turn Becket into a symbol of resistance against any king who dared challenge clerical authority. And it worked. The more the church amplified Becket's martyrdom, the more his shrine became a political statement. Every pilgrim who visited was subtly reminded, the church's power came from God, not from crowns. Even Henry's public penance at the tomb fed into this narrative, proof that earthly rulers bowed to heavenly justice. But here's the twist: not everyone bought the official story. Some whispered that Becket had courted martyrdom, that his stubbornness was less about principle and more about securing his legacy. Others questioned whether the miracles were staged to draw crowds and donations. Yet the church's version drowned out the skeptics, shaping history for centuries to come. Next, we'll explore whether there were darker forces at play, voices within the church itself that may have wanted Becket gone. Because when power is at stake, even saints can have enemies in high places. But what if the knights weren't acting alone? Let's dig into the whispers that Becket's murder was no crime of passion, but a cold, calculated hit. While Henry's infamous outburst might have lit the fuse, some historians argue the assassination was too precise, too well-timed, to be just 4 rogue knights acting on impulse. Take the knights' journey to Canterbury. They didn't rush there in a blind rage. They stopped to gather weapons and reinforcements, even seizing Becket's property along the way. This wasn't a spontaneous attack, it was a methodical operation. And then there's the murder itself. Witnesses reported the knights worked in unison, as if following a script. One pinned Becket down while the others struck. That level of coordination suggests planning or orders from someone higher up, so who else might have wanted Becket dead? Look no further than the English bishops. Many resented Becket's rigid stance on church privileges, which made their own lives harder. Some had even sided with Henry during Becket's exile. Could they have quietly encouraged the knights, knowing Henry's temper would take the blame? Then there's the nobility. Becket's defiance wasn't just a church problem, it threatened the king's ability to control his own barons. If Henry's authority weakened, so did theirs. A few well-placed hints from a powerful earl could have been all it took to turn the knights from frustrated courtiers into assassins. Even the Pope's silence raises questions. Alexander Roman III condemned the murder, but not immediately. Did he delay because some in Rome saw Becket as a liability? The archbishop's uncompromising stance risked dragging the church into a full-blown war with Henry. For a pope already juggling political crises, Becket's death might have been a grim solution. Of course, we'll never know for sure, but when you piece together the whispers, the timing, and the motives, one thing's clear. In the shadows of power, Becket had more enemies than just a furious king. Now, let's turn to those enemies within the church itself, because sometimes the greatest threats come from the very people who should have been on your side. Here's the next section of the script, seamlessly continuing from the previous content while introducing fresh insights and maintaining engagement. Now, let's pull back the curtain on Becket's own colleagues, the bishops who should have been his allies but may have secretly sharpened the knife. The English clergy wasn't a united front. Many bishops chafed under Becket's uncompromising leadership, especially when his rigid defense of church privileges made their lives harder. Take Gilbert Folliot, the Bishop of London. He'd clashed with Becket for years, even calling him a traitor to the king and kingdom during his exile. Folliot wasn't just voicing personal dislike, he represented a faction of bishops who preferred compromise with Henry over Becket's confrontational style. Then there's Roger of Pont-l'Evêque, the Archbishop of York. He'd openly defied Becket by crowning Henry's son as heir, a direct slap to Canterbury's authority. When Becket excommunicated Roger and other rival bishops, it wasn't just spiritual punishment, it was a power play. These men had wealth, connections, and reasons to want Becket gone. But here's the twist. Some historians argue these bishops didn't just stand back and watch Henry's rage boil over. They may have stoked it. Imagine the whispers at court. If only someone would deal with the archbishop's stubbornness. No direct order, just a nudge. And with Henry's infamous temper, that might have been enough. The timing is suspicious too. Just weeks before the murder, several bishops met with Henry in Normandy. We don't know what was said, but shortly after, the king's fury reached its peak. Coincidence? Or did someone hand Henry the perfect excuse to rid himself of a thorn in his side, while keeping their own hands clean? One thing's certain, Becket's death didn't leave these bishops weeping. Many quickly reconciled with Henry, their rival gone and their positions secure. So ask yourself, in a Game of Thrones where power was everything, did some in the church decide martyrdom was a price worth paying? Next, we'll examine an even bigger player in this drama, the Pope himself. Because when it comes to shadowy motives, Rome's silence speaks volumes. Now, let's turn our attention to the highest authority in the church, Pope Alexander III. While bishops may have whispered against Becket, the Pope held the real power to protect him. So why did Rome's response feel so lukewarm? Alexander had a delicate balancing act. On one hand, he needed to defend the church's independence, which Becket symbolized. On the other, he couldn't afford an all-out war with Henry II, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. When Becket was exiled, the Pope supported him, but cautiously. He never excommunicated Henry, only negotiated. Some say that sent a clear message: Rome wouldn't go to the mat for Becket. Then came the murder. Shockingly, Alexander took weeks to condemn it. His eventual excommunication of the knights felt more like protocol than outrage. Compare that to how quickly he'd canonized Becket as a martyr, almost as if a dead saint was more useful than a living troublemaker. Here's the uncomfortable question: did the Pope see Becket's death as a way out? With Becket gone, Henry could be humbled through penance without further rebellion. The Church kept its moral victory, and Rome avoided a messy conflict. Even Becket's biographer, John of Salisbury, hinted at this, writing that the Pope seemed more relieved than grieved. But let's be fair, Alexander was no villain. Medieval politics were brutal, and his hesitation might have been pragmatism, not conspiracy. Yet in a story full of shadowy motives, the Pope's silence remains one of history's most intriguing whispers. Next, we'll follow the money, because when power and wealth collide, even martyrdom might have a price tag. Now, let's peel back another layer of this mystery: money. Because in medieval England, power and wealth were often two sides of the same coin. Thomas Becket's fierce defense of the Church's financial privileges didn't just ruffle feathers, it threatened the pockets of some very powerful people. At the heart of the conflict were the Church's vast lands and tax exemptions. Becket insisted that clergy accused of crimes be tried in church courts, which couldn't impose the harsh fines or property seizures that royal courts could. For Henry II, this wasn't just about justice, it was about revenue. Every cleric who escaped royal punishment meant lost income for the crown. And then there were the Church's sprawling estates, which paid no taxes to the king. Becket's stubbornness turned these financial tensions into a powder keg. But it wasn't just Henry who stood to lose. Many barons and nobles had grown rich by leasing or controlling church lands. If Becket's reforms took hold, their fortunes could crumble overnight. Some historians suggest these men had as much reason to want Becket gone as the king did, maybe more. After all, Henry could afford to play the long game with the church, but for lesser nobles, financial ruin was a sharper threat than royal displeasure. Then there's the chilling possibility that Becket's murder was meant as a message. By cutting down the archbishop in his own cathedral, the killers may have been warning the church: defy secular authority, and even your holiest sanctuaries won't protect you. It's no coincidence that after Becket's death, Henry quietly reclaimed some church properties while carefully avoiding a full-scale confrontation with Rome. Yet money alone doesn't solve this mystery. If profit was the only motive, why kill Becket so publicly, risking backlash? Why not poison or a quiet ambush? Unless, of course, the spectacle was part of the point, a brutal reminder of where real power lay. Next, we'll step into Becket's final moments, where his own words may hold the key to whether he saw his death coming. Now, let's turn to the haunting final moments of Thomas Becket, words spoken in the shadow of death that still echo through history. As the nights closed in, Becket reportedly said, "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church, I am ready to embrace death." These weren't the panicked cries of a man caught off guard. They were a declaration, almost a challenge. Some historians argue this was proof Becket knew his fate. After years of exile and conflict, he may have seen martyrdom as the ultimate victory, a way to cement his legacy and humiliate Henry II. Think about it, a murdered archbishop becomes a saint, while the king who opposed him is remembered as a tyrant. Becket was a shrewd politician. Could he have calculated that his death would achieve what his life could not? Others believe his words reveal something deeper, a genuine willingness to die for his faith. Medieval Christians revered martyrs, and Becket's rigid principles suggest he might have viewed his death as divine purpose. Witnesses claimed he knelt calmly, almost inviting the blows. If true, this wasn't just acceptance, it was surrender to a higher calling. But here's the twist: even if Becket welcomed martyrdom, that doesn't mean his killers intended to make him one. The knights might have seen his defiance as arrogance fueling their rage, or perhaps they underestimated how swiftly the church would turn his death into propaganda. Either way, Becket's last words transformed a violent crime into a sacred narrative, one that would outlive his murderers by centuries. Next, we'll examine why these knights, despite their bloody deed, never faced the justice you'd expect. How did 4 men who killed a saint in cold blood walk away with their lives? Now, let's unravel one of the most puzzling questions surrounding Becket's murder. Why did the knights who killed him escape the harshest punishments of their time? On the surface, slaying an archbishop in a cathedral should have meant certain death for the perpetrators. Yet Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton never faced execution. So what shielded them from the full weight of medieval justice? First, consider the political landscape. While the church swiftly excommunicated the knights, secular punishment fell under King Henry II's authority. Here's where things get murky. Henry's infamous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" had set the tragedy in motion. If he ordered the knight's execution, it would have been an admission of guilt, confirming he'd orchestrated the assassination. Instead, Henry chose a middle path. He exiled the knights but allowed them to flee to castles in northern England, effectively giving them sanctuary. Some historians argue this was a calculated move to avoid further scandal while appeasing public outrage. But there's another layer. Medieval justice wasn't just about laws, it was about power. The knights were high-ranking nobles, and executing them risked alienating other barons loyal to Henry. The king needed their support, especially with Becket's martyrdom turning public opinion against the crown. By sparing the knights, Henry may have been securing his own political survival. Then there's the church's role. Surprisingly, Pope Alexander III didn't demand blood. Instead, he ordered the knights to serve 14 years as penitent knights in the Holy Land. Was this mercy or a quiet deal with Henry to avoid escalating the conflict? Either way, the punishment was symbolic, far lighter than the grisly fate usually reserved for those who killed men of God. Yet the knight story doesn't end there. Legends claim they met grim fates. Some say they died in agony, haunted by their crime. Whether divine judgment or poetic rumor, it hints at a medieval belief that justice, even delayed, would find them. Next, we'll step into the modern era, applying forensic science to this centuries-old crime. Could bloodstains and weapon analysis reveal whether Becket's murder was a frenzied attack or a carefully planned hit? Now, let's step into the world of modern forensics to see what science can tell us about this ancient crime. Imagine investigators arriving at Canterbury Cathedral today, armed with the tools of 21st century crime scene analysis. What clues might they uncover about Becket's murder? First, consider the bloodstain patterns. Medieval chroniclers describe a brutal, chaotic attack. Becket struck multiple times, his skull split open near the altar. Modern forensic experts could analyze the angle and distribution of blood spatter to determine whether the knights acted in a frenzied rage or with calculated precision. Were the blows delivered in rapid succession, suggesting a sudden outburst, or do the patterns hint at a more controlled, deliberate assault? Next, weapon analysis. The knights reportedly used swords, likely broadswords or similar blades common to the 12th century. Forensic examination could reveal the depth and angle of each wound, helping reconstruct the sequence of strikes. For instance, if the fatal blow came from behind, it might support claims that Becket was kneeling in prayer, defenseless. Conversely, wounds suggesting a face-to-face struggle could imply resistance, changing the narrative of passive martyrdom. Then there's the question of coordination. Medieval accounts vary. Some claim the knights acted as a unit, others that the attack was disjointed. Modern crime scene reconstruction could test these theories. Were the knights positioned to corner Becket, or did they strike opportunistically? Blood trails, footstep patterns, and even the placement of discarded weapons could reveal whether this was a planned ambush or a crime of passion spiraling out of control. But here's the twist: medieval sources aren't always reliable. Chroniclers like Edward Grimm, who witnessed the murder, had agendas often portraying Becket as a saintly victim. Forensic science strips away bias, focusing solely on physical evidence. Yet even science has limits. Without the original crime scene intact, some questions may never be answered definitively. What's clear is this: applying modern techniques to Becket's death forces us to rethink old assumptions. Was it a messy, impulsive act or something far more sinister? The clues, centuries later, still whisper their secrets. Next, we'll explore how Becket's death reshaped the balance of power between kings and clergy, leaving a legacy that echoes through history. Now, shifting our focus from the forensic details to the broader consequences, let's explore how Becket's murder reshaped the very foundations of power in medieval Europe. His death wasn't just a shocking crime, it became a turning point in the centuries-long struggle between church and state. The immediate aftermath saw a dramatic shift in public opinion. Becket's martyrdom galvanized the church, turning him into a symbol of resistance against royal interference. Pope Alexander III's swift canonization sent a clear message: the church would not bow to kings. This emboldened clergy across Europe to assert their independence, setting a precedent that would echo for generations. One of the most tangible impacts came with the Magna Carta in 1215. While primarily a baronial revolt against King John, the document's clauses protecting church freedoms, like Clause 1, guaranteeing the church's liberties, were direct descendants of Becket's stand. The barons and bishops remembered Henry II's overreach and made sure future rulers couldn't repeat it. Fast forward to the Protestant Reformation, and Becket's legacy took a darker turn. Henry VIII, determined to break from Rome, ordered Becket's shrine destroyed and erased his name from church calendars. Why? Because Becket symbolized everything Henry opposed: a church that could defy a king. The irony was bitter, a Tudor monarch undoing what a Plantagenet had failed to crush, but the deeper lesson endured. Becket's death forced rulers to reckon with a simple truth: spiritual authority couldn't be wielded like a sword. Even as nations modernized, the idea that the church and state operated in separate spheres took root. From the American Constitution's First Amendment to modern debates over secularism, the shadow of that December night in Canterbury still lingers. Next, we'll see how artists and writers transformed Becket's story into a cultural touchstone, from medieval stained glass to 20th century plays. Turning now to the world of art and storytelling, Becket's murder didn't just shape politics, it ignited the imaginations of creators for centuries. Medieval artists were among the first to seize on its dramatic potential. Stained glass windows in Canterbury Cathedral, crafted just decades after his death, transformed the killing into a vivid tableau of martyrdom. Light streaming through the glass bathed the scene in an almost divine glow, reinforcing the church's message. This was no ordinary crime, but a sacred sacrifice. Jump ahead to the Renaissance, and Becket's story took on new layers. Playwrights like Christopher Marlowe wove his defiance into their works, often using him as a stand-in for broader tensions between authority and conscience. By the Victorian era, painters like George William Joy recast the murder with melodramatic flair, emphasizing Becket's stoic calm against the knight's brutality, a visual echo of the period's fascination with moral heroism. But perhaps no reinterpretation is more striking than T.S. Eliot's 1935 play Murder in the Cathedral. Written as fascism rose in Europe, Eliot framed Becket's death as a meditation on power and resistance. His Becket isn't just a medieval prelate but a timeless figure grappling with the cost of principle. The play's chorus of women voicing the fears of ordinary people made the 12th century feel unnervingly modern. What's fascinating is how each era molded Becket to its anxieties. For medieval believers, he was a saint; for Tudor reformers, a warning; for modern audiences, a mirror. And this cultural afterlife raises a provocative question. Do we remember the real Becket, or the versions we've needed him to be? Next, we'll step into Canterbury Cathedral itself, tracing the physical scars and recent discoveries that keep this mystery alive. To walk through Canterbury Cathedral today is to step into the very space where history turned on a single, brutal moment. The exact spot where Thomas Becket fell, marked now by a simple stone slab and a modern sculpture of crossed swords, still draws visitors into hushed silence. But look closer, and the cathedral reveals even more. Recent renovations have uncovered traces of the original 12th century floor, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims who came to kneel where Becket's blood once spilled. Just steps away, the site of his shrine tells its own story. Once a glittering monument encrusted with jewels and gold, it was destroyed on orders from Henry VIII during the Reformation. Yet fragments survive, carved marble, a single candle bracket hidden for years in the cathedral's archives. In 2019, archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar even detected the shrine's long-buried foundations, confirming its staggering size. Perhaps the most haunting discovery came in 2022, when restorers working on the crypt found faint red stains on a column near the martyrdom site. While tests couldn't confirm it was blood, the location matches medieval accounts of Becket gripping the pillar as he died. These physical traces, however small, bridge the gap between legend and reality. Now let's weigh the evidence ourselves. Was this murder a king's reckless outburst or something far more calculated? The answers might lie not just in documents but in the stones beneath our feet. Now let's piece together the puzzle. On one hand, the murder of Thomas Becket could easily be dismissed as a crime of passion, 4 knights acting on a king's angry words carried away by rage. Henry II's infamous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" might have been less an order and more a reckless vent of frustration. The knights, eager for royal favor, could have taken it too far. After all, medieval kings often spoke in hyperbole, and Becket's defiance had pushed Henry to his limit. The chaotic scene in the cathedral, with Becket resisting and the attack unfolding in haste, fits the picture of a violent, impulsive act, but the shadows run deeper. Consider the timing. Becket had just returned from exile, and his renewed defiance threatened Henry's authority at a critical moment. The knights didn't act alone in their journey to Canterbury. They gathered arms, sought out Becket with purpose, and even gave him a chance to relent before striking. This wasn't a brawl, it was a methodical confrontation. Then there's the question of Henry's later penance. Was his very public remorse genuine guilt, or a calculated move to distance himself from a plan that had spiraled out of control? And what of the Church's role? Becket's rapid canonization and the explosion of his martyrdom cult served the Church's interests perfectly, painting royal power as tyrannical. Could factions within the clergy have quietly encouraged Henry's rage, knowing Becket's death would become a weapon in their broader struggle? Even the knights' fates are suspicious, excommunicated but never executed, their punishments suspiciously light for such a sacrilegious crime. So where does the truth lie? The physical evidence, the worn stones, the faint stains can't tell us everything, but they whisper of a story more complex than a simple crime of passion. The real mystery isn't just who swung the swords, but who truly stood to gain. Now it's your turn to decide. Was Becket's death a tragic mistake or a murder centuries in the making? Drop your thoughts below. We're all detectives in this medieval mystery. Centuries have passed, yet the murder of Thomas Becket remains one of history's most gripping unsolved mysteries. Was it a king's reckless words taken too far, or a carefully plotted assassination? The evidence leaves room for both theories: Henry II's fury, the knights' calculated actions, even the Church's swift canonization, all pieces of a puzzle that refuses to fit neatly together. But this isn't just a medieval whodunit. Becket's story echoes through time, forcing us to ask hard questions about power and accountability. How far can words go before they become weapons? When does defiance turn into martyrdom? These aren't just debates for the history books, they're alive today, in clashes between authority and conscience, in the way we judge leaders and rebels alike. So, what's your verdict? Did Henry's rage spark a tragic accident, or was Becket's death a shadowy political play? Drop your vote in the poll below and let's keep the debate alive. And if you're hooked on unsolved mysteries, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got more historical enigmas coming your way. Thanks for joining the investigation, and remember, sometimes the past's darkest secrets are the ones that speak loudest to the present.